Hello, everyone. My name is Andy Carvin, and I'm Senior Fellow here at the DFR Lab. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our conversation today on reporting on 2020, the free press, disinformation, and election integrity. Today's panel is part of the Atlantic Council's Election 2020 series, which features conversations on the most critical issues at the intersection of domestic and international affairs that will influence this year's elections. This bipartisan series spotlights foreign policy and national security and how it's crucial to drawing attention to often overlooked topics in the run-up to the US elections. Now, today's event is specifically hosted by the Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, or DFR Lab. The DFR Lab exists at the crossroads of government, media, and technology, and it works to ensure accountability and transparency online and around the world. We're devoted to objective fact as a foundation of government for the people and by the people, and protecting democratic institutions and norms for those who would undermine them. We've been a leader in the community for building resilience against these unique vulnerabilities on disinformation and foreign interference, especially regarding elections here and around the world. Today, we're going to hear from leading media voices and how they're preparing to provide fair, accurate, and rapid reporting on the election and potential attempts to sabotage it. So today, I'm joined by Stacey Marie Ishmael, editorial director of the Texas Tribune, Ellen Nakashima, national security reporter for the Washington Post, and Brandy Zadrozny, investigative and features reporter for NBC News. After some opening remarks from each of the panelists, we're going to go to some discussion, and then we'll open it up for conversations from everyone here in the audience. So if you're joining through Zoom and you have any questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. You can also participate on Twitter using the hashtag ACElections2020. Again, the hashtag ACElections2020. So I'd like to kick it off by turning it over first to Stacey Marie.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I wouldn't say I'm excited to be here, but I don't think any of us are really excited to be here, given the context of the things that we're talking about. I mean, I want to start with a word that you used, which in terms of reporting, which was rapid. And I think from a newsroom perspective, one of the most important things that we as an industry have to do for this election is slow down, right? And which is the opposite of our most finely tuned instincts to be like breaking scoop exclusive first siren drama, etc., to make sure that we are not misrepresenting in this desire for and this urgency for speed what may well be a longer, more complex and more nuanced process than we've been historically used to. And I think that one of the biggest mistakes that newsrooms can make is continuing to fall into the trap of treating this like some kind of high stakes poker game or a sort of a hero villain narrative, when actually what we need to do as a service to our audience is really bring the level down slightly and help folks understand that counting can actually just be really pedestrian, and that's fine, or that there are laws that will say like whether you can sloganeer in front of something or not, and like that's a thing that happens, and it's a thing that's happened previously. Because I do worry that some of the 5 alarm fire instincts that we have around this are translating into coverage in unhelpful ways.
That's actually going to be one of my first questions, but before we dive into that, I'd like to give Ellen a chance to chime in too.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting this. Ellen Nakashima, and a national security reporter at the Washington Post, and I wholeheartedly endorse Stacey Marie just said about slowing down. In fact, that's one of the directives that our newsroom editors just issued. We just put out some new guidance, or they're in the process of putting out guidance for the newsroom in how to cover, in particular, foreign disinformation in the scenario of, say, a hack and leak, which I consider to be perhaps in the universe of foreign disinformation, the most potentially impactful type of information warfare operation. I come at this from having covered the Russian interference campaign in 2016, really sort of on the ground floor from the days of the Russian hack of the Democratic National Committee story, which I broke in June of 2016, and which I followed, and it evolved initially, thinking like everyone else, that was basically while it was pretty significant, that this was traditional political espionage of the type that foreign actors like Russia and China have done for years against political campaigns, trying to hack into their computer systems and steal information that would give those foreign governments insights into the potential next president of the United States. But then when we saw those 20,000, 22,000 emails from the DNC that were politically damaging dumped out online on WikiLeaks in July, I knew that this was no longer just straight political espionage, but Russia taking their game to a new level in the form of information warfare. And we can go into the differences between 2016 and 2020. I think we did learn some lessons back then and applying them today. As I, being a national security reporter, saw the significance, saw that in terms of this is pretty disturbing to see a foreign adversary trying to interfere in our US election in this fashion, whereas my colleagues on, say, the political staff were, because of their orientation, much more focused on the actual content of the emails and how that would impact the political campaign. And as a result, I think because of the dynamic of that race in particular, the political story dominated and had some unfortunately, the national security aspect of the story was underplayed. I think today we also risk maybe in the rush to compensate for what happened. We're ever so aware of and looking for the Russian interference, when in a way, I think it's the domestic disinformation threat that is perhaps the most, pervasive and impactful and dangerous. So we can't lose sight of that. And of course, the Russians will happily jump in and amplify that. But these are all the sorts of issues I hope we'll get to in our discussion today. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Brandy?
So I'm Brandy. I'm an investigative reporter at NBC News. And for the last couple of years, I've been reporting on extremism and disinformation online. That beat has been really niche for a really long time, and it takes many forms. I've been reporting on the anti-vaccination movement, conspiracy theories, white supremacist domestic terrorism, the far-right media machine. And this year, I've been focused on health misinformation surrounding COVID-19 and political disinformation ahead of the election. And I call it the boss level, what we're in right now, because all of the weird, insane rabbit holes that I've been falling down for the last, half decade have now sort of melded into this one animal that we're sort of fighting, and this disinformation boss. It's been remarkable with the pandemic. Everyone seems to be confused and scared and extremely online. And so, at the same time, we're seeing conspiracy theories everywhere, from, QAnon to the COVID deniers, and, also claims of rigging from the president of the United States, unfounded Antifa rumors that are leading to real militia-related violence, far-right instigation, far-left response. And then the cornerstone of all of that is, I think, the hiddenly viral disinformation, and it's spread in private groups, local chats, neighborhood groups. And so that's a new front for me. We've seen that globally, but in the United States, this is sort of a new dynamic. So while I also agree with Stacey Marie that we have to be slow in terms of a newsroom generally, I think that there are many of us who've been long time just disinformation, far-right media reporters now have to work faster than ever, because we're having to monitor the spaces that we usually do, but instead of the normal tipping point, we have to almost cut it off at the knees, we feel like now. So we're having to address, small community Antifa rumors before the president of the United States makes some wild claims, so we can point back. And that's sort of new for us. Anyway, there's a lot of work to do.
So I wanted to start by talking about something that Stacey Marie initially brought up, but you all framed it somewhat as well, and it is regarding the speed at which we respond to things, specifically in the realm of fact checking. A number of news outlets, Washington Post in particular, but others have developed stellar fact checking teams that are able to quickly mobilize and document in enormous detail sometimes when disinformation is floating around or when political candidates or those in power get it wrong. Having said that, it's still ultimately a defensive posture, if you will. It's always waiting to see what goes out first and then responding to it. So, given the state we're in right now, how appropriate is it for news outlets to essentially have an offensive posture in the sense of being able to anticipate what disinformation might be spreading, who might be behind influence operations, and getting ahead of the game so we're simply not playing a cat and mouse game in which we're essentially the mouse?
I have argued with people about whether this is a real distinction or just one I have in my head, but I think that there is a difference between the traditional and traditionalist approach to fact checking and some of the work that folks like Brandy and others have done so exceptionally, which broadly falls into like demystification and debunking. And to me, the distinction between those two things is we have treated fact checking as like if that's the point, right? Like an intellectual exercise in Pinocchios and like our job is done and like, look, we showed you that this thing was totally implausible and that's the end of the story and then we move on to the next thing. And I think, my perspective on this is I worked at BuzzFeed and I think BuzzFeed very, very early, like going all the way back to Hurricane Sandy, was the very first media organization that took what I consider to be the debunking approach, which it didn't just with a sense of intellectual righteousness tell you that a thing was wrong. It helps you understand what that thing was, why it was spreading, who was spreading it, what their motivations were, and what you needed to understand about like that particular context. And I think that really set the foundation for the excellent work that folks like Brandy and others are doing, and like the intellectual framework that I think the Washington Post has done such a good job of incorporating into the reporting. And so for me, like the idea that we're suddenly doing such a good job of fact checking. I still think we're doing a terrible job of fact checking because we're defining that in a really specific and unhelpful way. And I think the challenge that we have is, to Brandy's point about speed, it's not only that about speed, it's about the fact that newsrooms are really uncomfortable with visuals. And it's taken us a really long time as an industry to understand that so much of the misinformation and disinformation is like tied up in meme culture, and not having people on staff who understand how to interpret these things, how to take them seriously, how to articulate them for a broader audience, and without kind of, as Brandy knows better than everybody, like retransmitting those messages in unhelpful ways. And our tendency to prioritize like words and structure and things that we understand over this completely different vernacular really hasn't helped us.
Brandy, Ellen, do either of you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I sort of wanted to amplify a little on Stacey Marie's point about the difference between sort of fact checking and then what reporters on sort of the more of the national security, technology, and political desks are doing. I think we're trying to do a little more of the deeper dive into the content of the issues and the allegations, whether it's around Andrei Derkach, a former Ukrainian parliamentarian who seems to be trying to feed information to U.S. congressmen to further the narrative that also aligns with Russia's ideas. That Hunter Biden and Joe Biden were corrupt, and Ukraine. And this was all part of this Ukrainian effort to interfere in the 2016 election. And at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, we've just put out some of these new guidelines. And what I wanted to emphasize there is when we say slow down, it's slow down in fact in the effort to try to ascertain three important things when you get a hold of when there's information that's dumped out, especially if it's perhaps hacked and then leaked. The authenticity of the information, right? Is it accurate? Is it true? Is it real, or has it been faked somehow? The provenance of that information, right? Where is it coming from? Is it coming from Russian proxies, Russian government, domestic sources? And how do we know that? And the newsworthiness of that information, because not all information or disinformation that comes out is actually really that relevant or newsworthy. And so what we pick and choose to report on is also as much, I think, as part of the debate. Um, for instance, in 2016, the GRU did hack and leak emails from, yes, it was Admiral Breedlove, and put it up on a smaller site, DC Leaks, that didn't have many viewers, didn't get much traction. No one really covered it, didn't make a big splash. And that was an example of, just not covering something that, even though it was an example of information warfare, was not that relevant. On the news side too, traditionally, if we had seen something that wasn't accurate or true, we would probably have just sort of ignored it, not wanted to amplify it. But a recent example would be earlier this month when Kommersant, a Russian news site, put out a story about hacked information, voter information of millions of voters in, I think it was Michigan and some other states. It started to go viral, or pick up on Twitter, to the point that some of our editors were seeing it and saying, hey, shouldn't you be, we should follow this up, let's report on it. Well, we looked into it and quickly determined that this really wasn't hacked information, right? This was voter information that was publicly available, whether it was through FOIA or just going into the state voter registrar's website. But whereas in the past we might have just passed on it and ignored it, there was a sense that maybe what we needed to do was kind of debunk the story so that it didn't get further traction, have legs. And so we reported that, in fact, this information that appeared to be hacked wasn't hacked, and that state election officials and federal officials were telling us this was not going to have an impact on the 2020 election, it wasn't hacked. And we made sure that that was in the headline as well. So, to the extent that we can try to do some of that debunking in the main news pages of the paper, I think we're increasingly inclined to try to do so.
So, what do you do in a situation where you discover a bit of disinformation that's troubling but hasn't necessarily gone viral yet? Do you take a position of you simply watch and wait? Are there situations where it's of such concern that you raise it publicly before it's gone viral? I guess the point I'm making is, how do you strike the balance in such a way that you don't accidentally give more oxygen to things that could be dangerous, in the sense of interfering with democratic processes? Whoever wants to jump in on that, please. But Ellen, since you mentioned it, by all means, jump in first if you like.
Yeah, again, I think I would look at just first of all, what is the content of that allegation? I mean, the Dakash tapes that he leaked, people did report on it, but his allegations didn't seem to gain much traction. And the reporting that we did in the Washington Post tended to focus on how basically a lot of his claims were unfounded, and that this did seem to be, in fact, the intelligence community put out a statement that said this was sort of part of a Russian effort to try to undermine Joe Biden in the 2020 election. So I think that's the important context to give to a claim like that, to stories like that, to make sure that the piece of disinformation itself is put in broader context that is relevant and factual and as transparent as possible in terms of how the sources and how they get their information.
And Brandy and Stacey Marie, do you have similar policies in your newsrooms that, like when your BS detectors are going off, do you have a way of determining whether this is something that, if it gets ignored, it will eventually go away, or do you have to respond in a more timely fashion, even if it isn't something that hasn't passed that transom of virality yet?
Well, what we do is my colleague Ben Collins and I, we report very closely together, and we're also in a number of Slack rooms with disinformation researchers, Joan Donovan from Harvard Kennedy School, Shorenstein Center, Whitney Phillips from Syracuse, Kate Starver, and Megan Squire. So we are just very, very, we have a large team of people that don't always get a byline or even a quote that we talk about. So like the pandemic video is a really good example of that. You know, we saw the pandemic video coming for a week. We said, this lady she's on John F. Kennedy Jr.'s or Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s Instagram all of a sudden. She's being promoted on these conspiracy websites. She's just like heavily being promoted in the anti-vax community. And she would come and go. She's been around for years, but they were really pushing her. So we sort of knew, and she was making these new claims against Dr. Fauci. So we sort of knew that something was coming. And then when this pandemic video, which was just, you know, chock full of misinformation about coronavirus, including that, you know, the beach sand could, you know, cure you, and just this ridiculous, ludicrous thing, these ludicrous allegations, just lies upon lies. So when it did come out, we sort of knew it was coming. And we had all sort of said, should we do something? You know, on the run up, is it time? And we probably pre-wrote, just in terms of like talking with each other and researching. We had something like already baked basically when that did come out. And then we just started watching the numbers go up. And then it was like, okay, it's clear this is viral. Let's go about like this woman and her years of false claims and, you know, how she was discredited. We could give you the background on who is this lady that your mom just sent you on Facebook. So that's what we try to do. I think also pandemic taught us that maybe we were a little too late. And that for that instance, we are so careful about not amplifying, you know, misinformation that sometimes I think in this information environment, you know, we're not all playing by the same rules. And so it's just, I think that we could be a little more aggressive. I think BuzzFeed does a great job at that. I think that we do pretty well at that, but I think that there's something to say, something to be said for this sort of thing is going around. You might see something soon where maybe you don't promote it like hell, but that it's there. So when you do see it before it hits your mom, you can send her this and say, oh, wait, you know, BuzzFeed or NBC News just did something about this. This is who you're about to see. I think that's helpful. And we don't quite do that enough because we're so frightened.
And so being a bit more aggressive, essentially it's in the public interest to be able to respond in a more timely fashion sometimes.
I think one of the other things that is essential to, you know, to Brandy's point about like inoculating people against you, as it were, is what is the actual accurate information that they need to have, and is that also out there, right? So one of the perspectives that we have as the Texas Tribune is we have, as a media organization, deep expertise in and about Texas, and every now and then, like, Texas becomes a national story and a bunch of people are talking about it, and you're like, not as straightforward as you think, which is, you know, like the usual local news versus national news dichotomy. But it gives us both a unique power and a unique responsibility, which is when we see someone making claims that can transform into misinformation, disinformation, or propaganda. And the White House has in fact attempted to use our own reporting, so the Tribune's own reporting, to make claims not in fact substantiated by that reporting. We then say, okay, what do we need to put out there as sort of a preventative measure? Because we see conversations about this kind of thing picking up, right? If people are starting to say, oh, in so-and-so county, this thing is happening and it's like really illicit, it's like, we can proactively say, like, that's not actually happening, here's what's going on, without in some cases needing to repeat the rumor, right? I think that there's a lot more work that media organizations can do in terms of flooding the zone with information so that there's less of a vacuum for misinformation and half-truth to spread. I've been on the like headlines are an atomic unit of content train for a really long time, and I think that the biggest L's that media organizations unnecessarily take is that we still treat headlines as a thing that in and of themselves are immaterial, and you have to read the story to get the full context. And it's like that notion, you know, and like AP has come under a lot of fire for this, especially, that putting something in the headline, we need to do a better job of providing that context there, right? Like, you don't live tweet the press conference and just repeat all the lies. Like, few people can do what Daniel Dale does, but I think that's the model of helping people understand. It's like, that's a claim, this is a fact, and you don't have to be emotional or emotive about it, but making sure that you're not only are you not amplifying the untrue thing, but you're making sure the true thing gets out there.
So I'm curious, what are you doing in your newsrooms that's different from how you handled things back in 2016? Have you put new editorial practices in place, and how do you feel that's going so far?
Well, I think the first thing is this is not, hopefully for most other newsrooms, this wasn't a conversation that started like now, because I think the biggest thing, in our newsroom, I started at the Tribune in March, and which was, we were like, oh, there's a pandemic. And so that alone forced some very different things to happen in terms of what we were thinking about and what everyone had to skill up in knowing how to do. It's like you go from zero to needing your entire newsroom to be quasi-health experts. And I think one of the effects of that pandemic for us is it really forced even more intensely like cross-beat collaboration, right? Like you can't write an education story without talking to your health reporter. In the same way, if we're writing stories about masks not being required at polling stations in Texas, like that's an election story, but it's also a health story. It's also a demographic story. And so that necessary confluence of people and beats has, I think, also helped in terms of our preparation for the elections, because it's not a case of like there's 4 politics reporters and they're the election team. It's like, no, your whole newsroom is the election team, and different people are going to have different kinds of responsibilities and understanding. These are the kinds of stories that we're going to need to write, and it's not only about who wins, who loses, who concedes. It's all of the steps going into that, all of the things that make that process possible. And to Ellen's earlier point about just like a memo about slowing down, it's also the notion of we don't need to say anything until we need to say something, right? Like there is no false sense of keeping up with anyone else. If we make a decision to publish something, it's because we've gone through the process for us of saying, this is the time, this is the bar, this is the threshold, and now we are ready to do this. It doesn't matter who else might be doing something. And that, I think, is all well and good in theory, but like in practice is really the hardest thing, particularly for reporters and for editors as well. Like you have this kind of competitive pressure, often self-imposed, to try to be first. But I'm definitely in a situation of trying not to break democracy, which is more important to me than being first on something.
Yeah. And the other thing is the Washington Post is a large newsroom. Maybe 750. I've lost count of the number of journalists we have, and so there is, and many of us tweet. I mean, we're expected to, we're encouraged to. So one of the other directives that I think is being put out is, or should be, if it's not already, is that before anyone wants to or thinks to retweet a story that looks sensational, sexy, really interesting, provocative, but might be part of a disinformation campaign, they should they should not tweet that out. Not until, as I said earlier, we've determined that the story itself is authentic, is newsworthy, and we know the provenance. So that's one of the new pieces of guidance we've got. Now, we'll see how it works in practice. Stacey Marie said, you hope that people didn't just think about now. Well, unfortunately, it takes a long time to turn around this large ship of a newsroom at the Washington Post. So I think we're only now starting to really focus on that. At the same time, we also have much more cross-desk coordination. I alluded to earlier sort of the disconnect between the national security and politics staffs in 2016. Not so today, especially in part because of the Russia investigation and impeachment. There was already a lot of cross-fertilization and a lot of talking between reporters and editors. That's all kind of organically just led to more coordination on all of these stories, which, as you noted, Stacey Marie, includes, health and science, technology, social justice reporters because of the protests and racial unrest. So we're all kind of in this together and having to crowdsource our insights and expertise.
So we're beginning to get some questions coming in from the audience. And again, if you do have a question, please jump in by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The first question comes from Aaron, and he'd like to ask, to the extent that you're aware, what sort of pressure have your organizations put on social media platforms to mitigate the impact of doxing, journalists and organization impersonation, and other tactics used to target the information ecosystem? Have news media orgs put any sort of collective pressure on social media companies to protect legitimate reporting and the reporters?
We've reported on this for like 4 to 5 straight years. I don't think there's been a week in a long time in which one or more of the organizations represented on this panel and generally hasn't had a story about, here is a terrible piece of misinformation that's been floating around the platforms did nothing about for X amount of time. I mean, like Brandy alone, like what is it, like 12 stories in the past 4 days. So I think there is a difference, however, between, like, there is no such thing as a collective of media organizations. We're all too individualistic and complex for that. But I do think individual journalists and coalitions of individual journalists have spent a long, long time on every possible forum. You know, you will see reporters engage with individual executives of these social media companies. I lived in Silicon Valley for a while, and I knew some of these folks in person, and we'd be like at a dinner or something. I'd be like, "Can we talk about this thing that y'all are doing?" You know, so it's the individual and for whatever collective advocacy exists has been profound, represented in the reporting, represented in the conversations. Like the executives of media companies are trying to talk to platforms, but like we are not a regulatory body, right? And there you only, your reporting can go so far, and the effort, those individual efforts can go so far, but it is well beyond not just our job descriptions, but our power to fundamentally change with any kind of punitive penalty attached the decisions of these incredibly large multinational organizations, right? The Washington Post newsroom's like 700 odd journalists, mine way smaller, but the design team at one of these tech companies is like 700 people, right? Like we're talking about a resource mismatch that is profound.
Brandy, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question, the specific part of the question that was like, do journalists or does the media, advocate for almost itself, right? There seem to be some like harassment issues in that question, or like
Yeah,
issues of like
harassment and
subterfuge
doxing.
or trying to like trade up the chain, something like that. I mean, I can say that again, where there is no the media, but at NBC News, no. I think that would be, we try not to make ourselves the story, and we try not to make ourselves the subject. So I would never reach out to Twitter and say, excuse me, I have 1,000 QAnon people in my mentions. If that's not helpful to me doing my, like, I would never do that. Although there are hundreds of QAnon people in my mentions right now. But I think I just wanted to go back 2 seconds to the past question, because I think what has changed in my organization has been, and in every organization that I see, is the importance that they're giving to the subject of disinformation. And before executives at my own company called me and Ben the deep dark web reporters, and it was like, no, it's real life, it's just Facebook. So like trying to explain the different realities, as Kevin Roos from the New York Times explains, that like the things that we're seeing on TV and traditional media outlets and like very good stories that should be written in the newspaper is totally different from what we're seeing in this online ecosystem. And that online ecosystem has taken over everyone's brains at this point, and we have to start treating that with importance. And I think that, at least in my company, like we are very, very serious. We have meetings upon meetings of getting, people in all kinds of different beats ready for the disinformation that we're seeing on the internet. And that's been really cool. But we would never, the platform companies aren't helping us at all do that work or protect ourselves.
Yeah, and to Brandy's point, like my colleague Millie Tran, who's our chief product officer, and I just put together a reading list for all reporters and editors, which includes some of Brandy and Ben's work on, like where did Q come from and all of these different things. So I think that the mere fact that there is enough now that we could put together a reading list is already really different from 2 years ago. You know, the like first draft used to be a lone voice in the wilderness, and now, you know, Claire is the busiest person alive. You mentioned the Shorenstein Center. I think that the seriousness of this thing has sunk in. I don't know if every newsroom has the capacity to act in the same way, and that's really what stresses me out.
Well, do you worry that that some newsrooms are essentially fighting the last war, that they're still staring back at 2016 and all the craziness that happened there, and they've structured themselves to report around those types of stories rather than being adaptive enough to be dealing with the facts, as one of you mentioned earlier, that how memes, whether it's on TikTok or elsewhere, are becoming such an important way of spreading disinformation. Do you worry that too many outlets are still stuck somewhat in the past on this?
I mean, newsrooms are always fighting the last war. Like, we don't have enough money as an industry to be all fighting the current war. And so, yes, as a baseline, I do worry about that. But the other thing that I worry is when we are talking about the internet, right? Like, when we are, to Randy's point, this is not like the darkness. There is darkness, to be clear, but this is just pedestrian. You may encounter this on WhatsApp, like you log into Instagram, it might be there. One of the things that is not helped is when societally and sort of culturally, we still have this tendency to either deify or patronize technology, right? And that is true. That's partly a function of the media reporting on it, and my very specific beefs with other tech reporters are like a story for Twitter. But it's also just kind of culturally, particularly in the US, this valorization of certain types of CEOs, certain types of organizations, makes it a lot harder for the reporting, even when we are prepared to break through, because we're up against like stereotypes and beliefs about how things should work and who has access to what, and if you fall for misinformation, you must be stupid. That is like deeply unhelpful in terms of even when we are giving everything that we can to this conversation.
I want to just piggyback on that to add that we also have a tendency to ascribe too much power and significance and importance sometimes to the foreign actor, for instance, Russia, which, after 2016 became the big bogeyman inspector because, they supposedly got all of this, they posted all these ads and pages on Facebook and Twitter and had all this traction when in fact, I think their most impactful actions had to do with hacking and releasing these emails through WikiLeaks. And we really don't know the full impact of their actions via social media, although there's been research done by academics, including Kathleen Hall Jameson, who conclude that, in fact, now that the social media aspect of the campaign was not did not have the sort of impact that most people think perhaps it does. So I think we have to be mindful to scope the threat in appropriate terms, because that is the only way we're going to be able to fashion effective and appropriate deterrent actions and responses, whether that's via social media companies, civil society, the media itself, us, or importantly, the government, right? And because the government itself has certain tools that it can use against foreign actors, but it can't against US persons and citizens who have constitutional First Amendment protections, whereas the social media companies have more latitude to take action in that area. And I think we have to understand all of those constraints and just facts of the situation as we discuss the matter. What is disinformation? What is the actual impact? What are the underlying causes that make disinformation effective? That give it traction and purchase? It's our underlying fissures in our society, right? The social, economic, racial, cultural, religious divides that can be exacerbated and exploited. When we act to sort of start to heal those, then all of these efforts, whether they come from QAnon, the White House, or the GRU, will have less impact. Stop there.
In some ways, it almost feels like the Russians could sit back and cross their legs and not put much effort into this because in so many cases we're doing this to ourselves. So how do we go about reporting on domestic influence operations, domestic disinformation narratives, when society has become so divided that when we describe what we see as disinformation or falsehoods, aspects or significant aspects of the public see that as attacking their values or attacking their point of view?
I think that the depth with which we report on these issues is really important in terms of, if you're just, that's why sometimes fact checking isn't as helpful because it's just, fact or not a fact, true or false. But if we can say, QAnon is an insane conspiracy theory that comes from anti-Semitic views held for ages. And here is how it started, and here's why it came to you. I think that like that sort of depth is a lot harder to just dismiss. And I think that even people I think that there are a lot more fence sitters than we give people credit for too. I do think that there are a lot of people who just aren't as loud. And so we don't see them on social media and they don't go viral on social media. But I think that and they don't go to Trump rallies, so we don't have cameras to film them all the time. But there's a large contingent of people who are fence sitters who reach out to us all the time and say, oh, my mom sent me this thing and I didn't know about it. And, now I'm reading and I sort of understand that it came from some internet admins and a YouTuber. And like that sort of depth of explanation takes a ton of time. But I do think, again, like the QAnon piece that we wrote in 2018, sort of looking at the history of the movement and how it came to be, it's still one of the most widely read articles. It's in, the top 10 all the time. It's become evergreen because people do want to deeply understand this. And I think that is sort of the answer, at least for me, instead of just pointing and saying misinformation, disinformation, misinformation. That's not like that's an empty calorie. I think the people in here that are hungry for proper information need a full meal.
To the point about depth, I also think we really underserve non-English language audiences, right? And if you spend 5 minutes in non-English language like media, I mean, there was this horrifying situation in Florida where part of the newspaper was an insert in the Spanish language insert, Miami Herald, was publishing just wildly anti-Semitic, racist, transphobic, in the news organization itself. And I think very similarly, we do need to accept and understand that very many people in the United States aren't at all consuming English language media. And so if we as newsrooms are trying to really serve our audiences, I think about this in the context of Texas a lot, right? This is a state with a significant number of Spanish-speaking and Spanish-speaking only households. Are we getting the useful information to them? And I definitely think that across everything that we're doing, we would have so much more of an impact if, we have the resources for sure, but if we had the ability to do a better job by our non-English language audiences.
So we get a couple more questions that have come in. And again, since we have about 15 minutes left, if anyone wants to submit, by all means, please do by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom. This next question comes from Gary. And Gary writes, journalistic objectivity requires that a journalist not be on either side of an argument. If one side of the argument is lying and the other side is based on objectively verifiable truth, shouldn't the journalist expose the lie and research and or present the facts? I think that's possibly a rhetorical question, but having said that, how do you go about reporting when, at least in this particular election cycle, there seems to be a predominant amount of disinformation circulating more from the right than the left? So with that being the case, how do you deal with accusations of not being objective when you're having to spend a significant amount of time dealing with rumors that are being amplified from the political right?
I think you have to distinguish between good faith criticism and bad faith piling on, right? And many news organizations waste everyone's time engaging with incredibly bad faith coordinated campaigns. individual reporters get targeted by this constantly, entire newsrooms get targeted by this, specifically people who are not white men. And when you talk about fighting the last war, like that is one of the dumbest things that media organizations have not been able to get their act together on, which is like, there are going to be people who will take the boldest statement of fact and use that to argue and assert, often very loudly and all the way up the chain, that you are yourself a conspiracy theorist of some kind. Like, it is a lost cause to attempt to engage with that kind of behavior, and we still do it. The difference is we have to acknowledge that power is a real thing, and that that's going to be a consequence of reporting when you have a political party or a president or arms of government that are very specifically using a system that has relied on genteel norms of engagement to entirely upend that, right? And if we are unwilling to change our own rules of engagement and to say, we're going to have to call this thing a lie, we're going to have to say why this is not true, we're going to have to avoid repeating this just in quotes and saying, you know, well, so we said so and so said, and that's okay. And that's very uncomfortable for a lot of newsrooms. It's like very uncomfortable, especially for people who spend a lot of time in print traditions, and it's incredibly uncomfortable for people who have spent their entire careers reporting in DC. And I think that one of the reasons you've seen other desks outside of politics desks do a better job of this is because we're not operating from that place as the default. We're not operating from access or sourcing or relationships or the dinner party as like the nexus that matters the most. And I really hope that, you know, over the next 4 years or however long it takes, like the rest of our orgs will catch up accordingly.
It's a really smart observation. I just do also want to say that I've seen the evolution over the past 3.5 years of my colleagues, especially those on the politics and White House staffs who are covering this president 24/7. And I don't remember when, but they have, you know, at some point it became commonplace to say flat out that, you know, the president is making, you know, an unfounded claim or with stating without corroboration or without evidence, certain, you know, whatever it was. I mean, I remember early on back in February, March 2017, when President Trump tweeted out something about how the Obama administration had wiretapped Trump Tower. And I was like, what? I mean, I knew that was incredibly insane. And I, you know, rushed to write a story about how that's what he said and how it wasn't true. But, you know, that became the norm at that point for after a while, right? And so I think we have all become, even mainstream reporters now, used to the fact that we are having to call out the president of the United States and other officials for claims that are unsubstantiated, and including claims that, you know, are contradicted by members of his own administration. But I too take your point to heart about how we just have to grow thicker skins, because we are all getting attacked and trolled and called enemies of the people and fake news and Amazon, Washington Post, and just have to, you know, those come from people generally of bad faith, and we just have to ignore it and continue to just focus on what our job is. And that's reporting, trying to get facts, put them in context, get the truth, get it out there. Can't let the other stuff around us distract us.
Or at least have a really good therapist.
Yeah.
Randy?
Oh, I just want to say, yeah, we've been dealing with this like both sides issue for years now, especially, and like, you know, we saw it when white supremacists shot and killed a ton of people last year. We saw it with Antifa versus Patriot Prayer, a group that is known to be a far-right instigator. We've seen it with media manipulation, and we've seen it with just disinformation generally, domestically. You know, people yell, why aren't you fact checking? Why hasn't Facebook fact checked Joe Biden's ads? It's because Joe Biden's not lying in them. And that's a fact. Like there's no spin I can put on that for you. There's no other way I can describe it for you. It's because, you know, no one from the far left was going inside of, you know, going into crowded, you know, shops and shooting Black and brown people. That's because we're not seeing the same level of all of these incidents from the far left. And so to even even mention that Antifa is now my new thing, but like even mention Antifa alongside, the far right instigation that we've seen over the last 4 years is doing a real disservice to our audience because it's making them seem like they are equitable and it's just not
Exactly.
the same.
Exactly.
So we have a question here from Shireen Mitchell. Hi, Shireen. Thanks for joining us today. Shireen wanted to ask, how do we defend against using that this is about freedom of speech when even news organizations put disinformation in headlines? The way that the First Amendment has been weaponized by both Russia and those that believe they should have the freedom to harm, threaten, and silence others who are actually protesting against things like racism, sexism, and state-sanctioned violence.
I mean, I think that's very much an extension of this discussion, right? About freedom from speech does not mean freedom from consequences in general. And in addition to that, media organizations, as one of the, hopefully, institutions protected by various amendments, also have responsibilities, right? And I think that it is a disavowal of responsibility to become stenographers. And that's never been the point. And I think that we can, with, like Brandy made the point about Patriot Prayer, and I think, Brandy was also been reporting on the fact that many local media organizations are just not equipped to understand the difference between an actual gathering of people concerned about child abuse and a gathering of people who are not remotely concerned about child abuse and are in fact violent anti-Semites who claim to be concerned about child abuse. Like there's a level of expertise that's sometimes required to have these conversations, and we just haven't resourced media organizations for a generation to be able to scale up and to level up and to resource up in the way that this moment describes. And that to me is like the hardest thing about all of this is it's easy for, the three of us in newsrooms that are surviving, that have resources, that can hire reporters, that can spend time on projects to say, these are the steps you need to take. And then you have like Sinclair, which is telling you, and this is what you're gonna run, including for a while, potentially pandemic. And it's just like, we have to also have a conversation about the economic reality that a lot of people are facing and what that means in terms of their ability to cope with these kinds of threats.
Yeah, and I would say just really smart people that I talk to have made the idea of a distinction between freedom to and freedom from. And so, yes, someone may have freedom of speech, but that doesn't mean that Facebook needs to amplify these conversations or amplify the posts that harass, target, disinform other individuals. So, does Charlie Kirk have a freedom to say whatever the heck he wants on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and just lie constantly? Or do we, as members of this democracy, have a freedom from that garbage all the time and the harassment and, again, disinformation that all breeds? And I think that this is a question that platforms need to wrestle with and need to start answering for. And at some moment, they're going to, if they care about this stuff, have to start curating an experience where an algorithm gives us stuff that's not going to threaten our lives and our democracy and our health and our real relationships and all the rest.
We have another question coming in from Chase Small. Chase asked, how do your news organizations plan to approach election night, given the ample room for disinformation and the narratives forming around election night reporting and increased mail voting?
Well, we've been calling it election season as the first step, which is
yeah, like especially given that the early elections have already early voting.
This is not an election night problem, and the first step is not really like an election night problem for us.
Absolutely. I think we're prepared to, cover this election week, month, whatever it is for, the duration, and are preparing people, our readers, for the idea too that this is not something that's going to be decided on November 8th. And we're, echoing federal officials who are saying as much. And so we've got, I don't know exactly all of the plans, but we have huge coordinated teams of reporters who are going to be, and fact checkers who are going to be tracking everything in real time and trying to put up on our live blog what we're learning as we're learning it. I think they're still working out what the actual the platform will look like. But certainly some of these guidelines that I mentioned earlier are definitely going to be in operation to make sure that people aren't tweeting out misinformation. That would be the worst thing we could do, as people are voting.
So,
Yeah,
no, Brandy, go right ahead.
sure. Just really the same. I think that, I'm super proud to work at NBC News right now. We've just been having, so many meetings about this with, sort of titans of law and of politics, and just everybody getting together and just we're working out basically a threat scenario where if this happens, what do we do and how do we coordinate to make sure that I think that was really smart saying flood the zone with good information so that people have a frame of reference for when they're seeing something like this, when they're seeing some claim of election rigging or anything else, that they can go and do a Google search and not have, an empty vacuum of information there. They have things that they can turn to. So we're working on that. And we're just working on threat modeling and figuring out all that can go wrong based on what we know during this whole election season, and trying to shore up for that.
So we're down to just a couple minutes before we get to the top of the hour. So as a final question for me, given the fact that there's no way we can completely defeat disinformation, you can't have a war against disinformation. At best, you can mitigate its impact. Is there still room for optimism? Personally, or as a journalist, is there a light at the end of the tunnel that somehow our society will be able to get its head around this and let our better angels somehow prevail? Or are we entering a long haul of disinformation and grievances and more disinformation, just continuing in a cycle that's going to continue to hurt democracy?
Oh, I think we're going to have more for sure. Where I am hopeful, because I think to be in this industry, you have to be very optimistic about life. Where I am hopeful is that people will get better at understanding that it's happening and understanding how to deal with it, right? And to me, the thing I am most reassured by is like I have taught all my friends that if they retweet misinformation on the internet, I will like come after them so hard that now they just don't anymore, and they look out for our other friends and they look out for their parents. And like you have to start in the communities where you have people who trust you and people who will listen, because like that's the network effect that we need, right? Like random reporter on the internet saying this thing that you believe is untrue is much less helpful than a person in your life who you look up to and you respect saying this thing is not true and here's why. And like that to me is the most important thing. Like how do we as reporters do work that allows the people in positions to have those conversations to inoculate their friends and family against, this disease, as it were.
I think that there is just so much more general awareness of the problem now, and many, many more actors trying to take a stab at addressing it, whether it's through, civics education, media awareness training. It's in the civil society sector, the think tanks, the government itself, social media companies. I think those are all parts of the answer, sort of at a micro level. At a macro level, I think we really just still need to address the social, economic, racial, cultural, religious issues and divides that create the fertile territory, fertile ground for disinformation to have impact. Because once you can start to bring about a more cohesive, unified, but society that has respect for plurality and diversity, and where there's more respect for, and we can restore trust in democratic institutions, in the mainstream media, in a working government with democratic norms. When you've got all of that, then I don't think this disinformation will really have much of an impact. It won't be as big a problem, I should say. It will be sort of building herd immunity to it.
Ready? Any last thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just say I'm a trained librarian, and so like
Oh,
I come
wow.
at it.
That's so awesome.
I come at it from that stance in terms where I would, have information literacy courses and, help people at the reference desk who had questions about, how to mail a package, or if our, Vermont mayor was a Stalinist. I don't know. Like there's these crazy ideas. We had some, a lot of the same questions that I'm answering for the internet and for NBC News right now, I answered at the reference desk, from conspiracy theories to just like how to navigate life and all of the stuff within it. And I think that those one-on-one interactions at the reference desk, I came away feeling that I could help people and that they were smarter and felt more empowered. And I hope that as we do this work, and as, like you said, Stacey Marie, like we clean up our own information backyards instead of looking for the major polluters to do anything to help us, I think that there's some hope there.
I think we'd all be better off if every voter had their own personal librarian, but since that's not going to happen anytime soon, go to your local library or get information from them virtually. They're there to help you, and even though they're unsung heroes as part of this fight. And so if we can only have some more, I think we'd be in a better place. But with that, Ellen, Stacey Marie, Brandy, I'd like to thank you on behalf of DFR Lab and the Atlantic Council for joining us today. It's been a really illuminating hour. I could spend all day talking about these things, as I'm sure you could as well, but you also have very important things to do to prepare for the remainder of the elections. So again, on behalf of the DFR Lab team and the Atlantic Council, everyone, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it, and please stay safe out there.